Thanks, Roger. Peter queued up an important subject for us in his presentation a few minutes ago about what's happening in climate change and how that's leading to an increased severity and frequency of major storms. And we used to hear about the idea of the 100-year flood, and now the idea is the data seems to suggest the 100-year flood might be something that occurs a lot more often than every 100 years. What are the tools in our toolbox as we confront a world in which not only do we need to be smarter about how we generate electricity, but we also have to develop new approaches for dealing for those times when the grid goes down because of this increased severity of storms. So that's what I'm going to talk to you today about how what our research is showing on the potential for faster disaster recovery using distributed generation and related tools. But let's start off with the story about the transistor. You know, and anybody know where the transistor emerged from in its modern incarnation? Bell Labs, yeah. It emerged in the post-World War II era. It was almost immediately recognized to be a pretty big deal. So at that point, the TV companies, the RCAs, the Zeniths, the Victors started looking at it and asking, well, how can we integrate this transistor, which is the foundation of today's computer chips, microprocessors? How can we integrate that into television sets that run on vacuum tubes? But the problem is that it would be kind of like if you tried to use an old 286 Intel processor to run Office 2011 and do pivot tables. You know, the whole thing would slow down because the processor did not have the strength or the horsepower to really provide the necessary computing power. So the idea of using the transistor in television sets languished because it was just an underpowered piece of impressive technology that wasn't up to doing the big tasks that the TV companies used vacuum tube systems to do. But in the early 1950s, a startup company out of Japan named Sony started looking at the idea of saying, what if we were to use the transistor to put it into a crummy little radio and market it to teenagers? So a couple of problems with that, right, is, if you're a teenager in the mid-1950s and you wanted to listen to music, well, it turns out that not only was the TV a vacuum tube device, but so was the radio. So next to that big vacuum tube television that was in the living room, there was a big vacuum tube radio. And if you were a teenager and you wanted to listen to Elvis Presley or Chuck Berry or Little Richard or Buddy Holly, that meant you had to listen to it, where? In the living room. Next to who? Your parents, right? Yeah. This was gonna kill rock and roll before it was even born. So Sony comes out and they said, okay, we're going to use the transistor for this crummy little underpowered radio, and we're going to market it to people who have never bought radios before, named teenagers. But the message to teenagers was, hey, guys, you can afford it, and you can listen to the music you want to listen to anywhere. It was a huge global sensation. Taking the transistor and using it in an application to solve a problem that was emerging to be solved, which was the teenagers had a little bit more money and they had music they wanted to listen to that their parents were not that keen on them listening to. This device comes out underpowered, not able to compete with the conventional devices, but was a huge market sensation because it was able to solve a problem that vacuum tube sets couldn't. You couldn't make a vacuum tube radio that could fit in your hand and you could take out to a party with your friends way away from your parents. So over time, Sony improves the transistor, and they move it up into black and white TVs, and ultimately they move it into the Trinitron color television sets as the transistor and the related components improved. And then suddenly RCA and Victor and Zenith said, God, we've got to get ourselves a transistor television, but it was too late. Sony had been using transistors in consumer electronics for a decade, and they already had it over. It was already over. So as we entered this era now where we have these new technologies that aren't really able to provide that kind of consistent 24/7 horsepower that big power plants provide, well, what are those kind of niche applications that they would be good at that address some emerging problems that they would probably have some competitive advantages to do? So what we looked at is on disaster recovery. So there are two elements of disaster recovery. The first one is to figure out that you have a problem. Okay, it's kind of like alcoholism, power outage. It used to be that if you had a problem, you had to send people out in trucks and look and make sure that see if there were no lights on or other indicators of power outages. But now, with some of the advances going on, outage detection has actually been measurably speeded up and improved through the introduction of tens of millions of smart meters around the planet. But there remains a fly in the ointment on this, because the smart meters can tell you you have a problem, but they can't actually go turn your power back on for you if there's been some sort of massive storm that's wiped out the transmission lines. What you have to do is you have to have new tools in the toolbox that can deal with the increasing frequency of restoring power. So there is an element of restoring power that is just a laborious process. What you see is that if there is something like Hurricane Sandy or the big floods that happened in North Dakota and Nashville in the last couple of years, the derecho storm that slammed the mid-Atlantic region and Midwest earlier this spring, there's just a fixed amount of time to go repair lines, put them back up. This can take weeks. And during that process, people are uncomfortable. Their food spoils. And perhaps most significantly in the minds of people, they lose access to their iPhones. I heard a great story from one of the companies we work with that one of the guys, a consumer electronics company, had been stationed in East Timor. And they had solar panels there. And what were the people using the solar panels for? They were using them to charge their mobile phones. And then they were using candles for light. So we get a sense of where the priorities are, right? And that, in fact, you heard that the main beef from a lot of people on Hurricane Sandy was they lost access to the internet. Well, let's look at this then in the context of what if this starts happening a lot more often? Well, okay, let's take out what if. This is happening a lot more often. So how can we deal with almost like a triage approach of getting some level of power back on? Because as with the teenagers back in the 1950s, if they could hear any music at all with their parents not around, that was a huge improvement over waiting for their own apartment and enough money to buy a vacuum tube TV. Instead of waiting 5 years for that day, I'd like to have my music next weekend. So give me something I can use that helps me create an imperfect but better than zero solution to my challenge. So in the case of climate change, first off, one kind of challenge we're having to solve for a lot more frequently are rain-intensive storms. Derechos, hurricanes, hotter air can hold more water, and that means that we're having bigger storms, a lot more bigger storms. New England, for instance, since 1948 has had an 85% increase in big storms. This is happening all over the planet. And the features of rain-intensive storms, if you're going to create a solution for it, features of it are that rainstorms usually occur when? During hurricane season, spring. They usually occur when it's warm or even hot. And what happens then is, it doesn't matter how many great bells and whistles are on the grid if the grid is wiped out. And that's what happens in rain-intensive storms. So we are talking about having to solve for a situation where the improvements to the grid are somewhat rendered irrelevant, at least during that period of restoration, because the grid is gone or taken down. And then finally, they're associated with the air conditioning need. So if it's warm outside, it's muggy, it's hot, people want to be cool. Now there's a different kind of natural disaster, which is snowstorms. So ironically, right, we go like, well, global climate change producing more snow, but at least for a while it is, because if warm air can hold more moisture, then we have the weird situation of like what happened in Hurricane Sandy, where it hit a cold front over the Appalachians and actually triggered enormous amounts of snowfall that triggered power outages in parts of the country from a hurricane. So the features that you'd have to develop to solve for snow-related disasters in terms of faster disaster recovery would be, it usually occurs when it's colder outside. There is, again, it can sever the transmission lines. The damage is different, though. Water from floods can go into basements, Snow doesn't typically go into basements. Water can flood into substations, and it can cause damage on a scale that snowstorms typically don't cause. But nonetheless, we're talking some matter of degree here. They're associated with heating needs. It's cold, people need to be warm. And that usually happens during the night and in the early morning, by the way. So if you're going to develop something for faster disaster restoration using distributed generation, what are the metrics of what that system has to be? And by the way, this is from Bayonne, New Jersey. One building had power because they were able to provide their own power in an otherwise blacked out area. So the systems, if they're going to be used as distributed generation for power restoration, cannot be grid tied. You cannot have a grid going down, people producing electricity, but then sending it back out on the grid because that could electrocute line workers. It could get into flooded areas and cause even other additional electrocution risks. The systems have to be installed at the customer's premises. If you're talking about getting, and the customer's premises could be in an apartment building or an office building or a single family home. It has to be able to measure and prioritize circuits. If this is a triage system, if it's not able to provide 100% of the power that's needed for power restoration, well, what is it going to prioritize? It doesn't do me very much good if my electricity is powering my cable box and my food spoils. Now the options, let's talk about the options. So a couple of features we saw from distributed generation. I love this photo from New Jersey after Hurricane Sandy. Home ripped off its moorings, but the solar panels were just fine. And then what you notice here from the New York Times is the electric grid went down, but for most of the areas in Hurricane Sandy, the gas grid did not go down. All right, so we got some clues. Solar, gas, what can we do? So options, gas fuel cells. We'll get into these more here next. Rooftop solar PV. Remember, these have to be at the customer premises because the grid has gone down. The home and building batteries and home energy routers. So we are working with all these things at Pecan Street in our research trials. And what we're doing is we're capturing the deepest ever data that's been collected in terms of research trials in people's homes. So as we look to develop systems that have to be able to prioritize and measure and solve problems, well, we have the deepest ever data, and here's some of the things we've learned from it. So first off, if you're going to use a smart meter, the two options are 15-minute or 1-hour intervals, most commonly around the country. And what these tell you is these tell you some important things about whether the power's gone out. Like I said, smart meters are really important for solving the first question is, do I have a problem? So you can start getting the solutions deployed fast. But the challenge is that if you're looking for triage power, for faster power restoration, they don't give you the insights on prioritizing circuits. So you need some kind of a different approach. So customer home area network devices, home energy measurement systems, things like that that can measure the circuit level. This is Pecan Street research. This is one home. Spoiler alert, this is my home. I can talk about it. But we have strict privacy protocols as part of our research trials. We operate kind of like a clinical trials organization, but in consumer electronics and smart grid. But what we're able to find out here is you can see really on a minute-to-minute basis what's happening on a circuit-to-circuit basis in the home. Let's blow it up a little bit, and what you can see is just the nighttime hours. And what you can really start to tease out, for instance, that avocado bump up in the middle around 5, 6 o'clock is the microwave oven and toaster circuit. And, unsurprisingly, you'll see when you go look at the next slide again that it appears again in the morning. And same with our TV circuit, Sesame Street in the morning, in this case, the Olympics at night. But what you can start to find out is what's happening, when, where. Now, this is adding the air conditioning. All right, it's about the air conditioning. This is a real typical result from among the 480 homes in our research trials. But the challenge is you don't really have a lot of flexibility to ramp down under current technologies how high a given system draws, because that's somewhat defined by the architecture of air conditioning systems and their rating and tonnage under today's technologies. But as we look at this, let's break it down to the refrigerator level. So if you're going to just solve, for instance, priority one would probably make sure my food doesn't go bad. So what you can see is, take it up to scale. What you can start to see is at 1 minute intervals in this case, you can see when the air refrigerator's opened. This is, again, remember, using a customer hand device. A smart meter is not capable of reading at this level of detail. But now let's look at the options. Gas fuel cells. Gas fuel cells are starting to emerge, and they're different from gas generators, which are motors that run off natural gas and have ball bearings and moving parts. Gas fuel cells, so one option, one benefit of using a gas fuel cell as for faster disaster recovery is they can operate 24/7, 365. They are potentially portable. One could imagine FEMA or the National Guard or other disaster response agencies having truckloads of these things, and every time there's a disaster, going and installing them, if the right interfaces were defined, to get quick restoration, particularly for big buildings, because gas fuel cells, their sweet spot are, they don't have much maintenance. Unlike gas generators, they don't have moving parts like ball bearings and rotating things. So they have low maintenance, and they can serve buildings with high densities. So one could imagine that if the interfaces are defined well, using gas fuel cells to bring entire apartment buildings back online pretty quickly in the aftermath of a disaster. A place like Manhattan, gas fuel cells would be a good tool in the toolkit for faster disaster recovery. Some disadvantages of fuel cells: they don't ramp up and down well. They're not going to work under the current technologies. Those things we saw in single-family homes, gas fuel cells don't ramp up and down. They're not sports cars. They're 18-wheelers. They provide a lot of juice, steady state, but they don't ramp up and down well. And then they have some types of fuel cells have very high operating heat, which could be a problem depending on where they're put. Now let's look at solar panels. So this is from Pecan Street's research trials in the Mueller neighborhood in Austin. We're out of 600 some odd homes in the Mueller community. We have 210 in our research trials that have rooftop solar panels, either south or west. So some advantages of solar panels are they have low marginal generation costs. They basically have zero marginal operating costs because the sunshine, thankfully, is still free. And then another advantage are that the generation coincides with warm weather. Okay, you need air conditioning. Food's a risk of spoiling. Boy, if we had some kind of generation that worked well when it was hot and sunny outside, that's solar panels. Another advantage is low maintenance, few moving parts, as with fuel cells, but they're real passive systems with low heat, and then already deployed at the time of a storm. In other words, there would be no truck rolls to go put them in from FEMA. People would already have them. Some disadvantages are they would require a change in grid connections, so they couldn't be grid tied, or have some kill switch that would send internally, and it would be a triage service. You'd be able to prioritize stuff. So the complementary systems, batteries, about a 15 to 30 kW range, home energy routers, they would power probably priority refrigerator, air conditioning, and of course, your mobile phone. Thanks.